An American Airlines A300 finds itself in trouble minutes after takeoff. A loud noise from the rear is followed by parts of the plane breaking off and the doomed jet crashing into a New York neighborhood below. Eyewitnesses claim to have seen an explosion before the plane broke up. Was this a deliberate act, a fault with the plane itself, or simply a case of pilot error? This is the story of American Flight 587. At 19 AM on November 12, 2001, a somewhat delayed American Airlines Flight 587 was in its final preparations for takeoff for the almost 4-hour flight time from JFK in New York to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. The aircraft was a 13-year-old Airbus A300, one of 35 in the American fleet. On board were 251 passengers and 9 crew. The captain for the flight was 42-year-old Edward States, while the first officer and pilot in command for the morning's flight was 34-year-old Sten Molen. As American Flight 587 taxied toward the runway, another plane was moving into position to take off ahead of them, a Japan Airlines 747-400. At 9:14 AM, once the Japan Airlines plane was airborne, the captain of 587 radioed air traffic control requesting clearance for takeoff. Once receiving clearance, the controller warned the crew of possible wake turbulence from the preceding aircraft ahead of them. Wake turbulence is a disturbance in the atmosphere that forms behind an aircraft as it passes through the air. This can be extremely dangerous for smaller aircraft following behind a large jet, but not usually dangerous for larger aircraft. As the first officer moved the throttles to full power, the A300 began powering along the runway. Relief was felt among the passengers as the delayed flight was now finally on its way. Around 1 minute into the flight, the aircraft began experiencing some moderate wake turbulence caused by the Japan Airlines 747 ahead of them. To counter this, the pilots increased power, while First Officer Sten Molen made inputs to attempt to control the aircraft. However, what should have been a relatively mild and short-lived annoyance soon became serious as the plane swung violently from side to side and seemingly could not be brought under control. As the pilots continued to wrestle for control of the aircraft, a sudden loud bang from the plane's rear was followed by an immediate and total loss of control. The A300 began falling to the ground in a violent and uncontrollable spin. Moments later, the aircraft slammed into the ground with the loss of all on board and 5 on the ground. The aircraft had crashed in the Queens neighbourhood of Bal Harbour. Eyewitnesses on the ground reported having seen what they thought looked like an explosion, then pieces of the plane breaking off before coming down. While rescue workers attended the scene, government and city officials were on high alert. Being only 2 months on from the attacks on New York, there were fears American Flight 587 could be the result of a deliberate act. In the interest of caution, many of the city's tunnels and bridges were closed, flights across the country were cancelled, and many key buildings were evacuated, including the Empire State Building and the headquarters of the United Nations. In the hours after the crash, investigators located the plane's flight deck voice recorder. However, there was still no sign of the vital flight deck data recorder. The plane's vertical stabilizer was fished from Jamaica Bay, more than a mile from the main wreckage site. This indicated the plane had indeed broken up in flight, adding fuel to speculation that the crash may have been caused by a deliberate act. Rumours of foul play circulated throughout media and public discord, but the NTSB responsible for investigating the crash were not jumping to any conclusions. In the days following the disaster, investigators downloaded the contents of the flight deck voice recorder. It painted a picture of pilots struggling to control the aircraft amid wake turbulence, then a loud bang, a stall warning, and ultimately the end of the flight. For investigators, wake turbulence bringing down a large jet was almost unthinkable. So, was the loud bang heard on the recording an indication of a deliberate explosion? Investigators were not so sure and began focusing their attention on the plane's vertical stabilizer, which had detached first during the flight. With close inspection, investigators uncovered that all 6 points where the tail attached to the main fuselage had snapped off. This was a major breakthrough and put any questions of a deliberate act to rest in the minds of investigators. However, with one thing ruled out, the next question was, is there an underlying fault with the A300? How could the vertical stabilizer simply rip off? With hundreds still in operation, investigators needed to find out. The Airbus A300 was one of the first aircraft constructed using carbon composite materials. Investigators feared this might be a dormant weakness in the design of the aircraft. Both the tail and the broken connection points were handed over to NASA to conduct further testing. Investigators were about to get another break. The all-important flight deck data recorder had finally been located. Eager to get an insight into the control inputs in the final moments of Flight 587, the recorder was sent to its manufacturer to have the contents extracted. Investigators discovered that in the moments after the flight hit the wake turbulence, First Officer Sten Molen had made a series of puzzling inputs. While attempting to get the aircraft out of the turbulence, he had made 5 hard rudder inputs, from full left to full right, with the 5th input aligning with the timing of the loud bang. This made it clear to investigators that the vertical stabilizer had broken off with the violent moving of the rudder. However, the NTSB team were not convinced that such inputs could realistically cause the tail to break off. But, supporting the theory, NASA concluded that the carbon composite material used in the lugs to attach the tail to the fuselage passed the test by more than double the required standard. So investigators ran a series of computer-simulated tests to determine if the inputs by the first officer could indeed cause the tail to break off. Investigators were shocked when the results came back. The aerodynamic loads caused by the actions of the first officer produced more than 200,000 pounds of force on the vertical stabilizer, far above the 100,000 pound certification standard, meaning investigators now knew the cause of the accident. Excessive use of the rudder at higher speed had caused such aerodynamic stress beyond what it was designed for that the vertical stabilizer could no longer sustain the pressure and was ripped from the aircraft. Investigators now needed to know why First Officer Sten Molen had used such excessive input on the rudder. The answer came from another American Airlines pilot who claimed the airline had trained pilots to use heavy rudder input in the event of wake turbulence. Airbus, the manufacturer of the A300, stated they had sent memos to American Airlines warning them of their training and that excessive use of the rudder at speed may pose a danger. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that the accident's probable cause was in-flight separation of the vertical stabilizer, caused by unnecessary and excessive rudder inputs by the first officer, brought about by incorrect training in dealing with wake turbulence by American Airlines. In the years following the crash, American received more than 250 lawsuits against the airline, all of which were settled for an undisclosed amount, estimated to be more than $500 million.